Hi, my name is Prashant Ilangovan. Welcome to the Flight School channel. In this video, part of the private pilot series, I will be covering the forces acting on an aircraft in a straight flight. By the end of this discussion, you will know exactly what are the forces that act on an aircraft, both on the ground and in the air, and how these forces behave when the aircraft is in a straight flight. You will get to know about weight, lift, thrust, drag, and terminologies such as vectors, resultant force, steady flight, equilibrium flight, and level flight. After you watch this video, try answering the questions in the description below. This will not only reinforce your learning, but also help you with your theoretical and practical exams, such as a computer-based knowledge test, skill test, or a check ride. Or do it just for fun. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss out on our videos. And now, forces in flight coming up. There are several forces that act on an aircraft while the aircraft is on the ground and in the air. Let me start by describing what a force is. A force is simply a push or a pull that acts upon an object as a result of the object interacting with its surroundings. You may be familiar with many of these forces and experience them in everyday life. Like weight, for example. The force of gravity pulls us towards the center of the earth, and we measure and quantify this force and call it weight. Likewise, when we push or pull an object, we apply a force on this object. We thrust it forward, and hence we call this thrust. In this example, I'm using my hand to produce thrust. In an aircraft, thrust is produced by the propeller or a jet engine. Notice when we move this object, there is resistance from the surroundings, more visibly from the surface it is moving on. Many of us may be familiar with this resistance and call it friction. If one was swimming or rowing a boat, this resistance of friction is felt in water as well. We call this friction or resisting force as drag. In fact, fluids, anything that flows is a fluid, such as water, oil, and even air, which is the fluid, offers resistance, that is drag. To overcome drag, thrust is required. With increased drag, increased thrust is required to move an object. Take a look at this rock. It's exerting weight towards the center of the earth as it rests. Do you think it is possible for this rock to rise up in the air, overcoming its weight? The simple answer to that is yes. All I need to do is apply a force opposing its weight and lift it. This force used to oppose weight and lift an object is called lift. I simply use my hand to generate the lift force needed. In case of an aircraft, this lift force is generated by the wings. How wings generate lift will be covered in a separate lesson. For the purpose of this lesson, just remember, lift generated by the wings are typically perpendicular to the plane of the surface of the wings. Weight, lift, thrust, and drag are the same four forces that act on an aircraft in flight as well. That is, the weight of the aircraft acts downwards towards the center of the earth. Lift, generated by the wings, acts against the weight. Thrust moves the aircraft forward. And drag, the resistance the air exerts on the aircraft, acts against the thrust. Normally, these forces are described as vectors, depicted by arrows. Vector in physics represents a quantity that has both direction and magnitude, that is, how much in size, amount, or to what extent. Take, for example, these two vectors representing two forces. Where the arrow is pointing to describes the direction of the force, and the length represents the extent of the force. A longer vector represents more force or magnitude. You may be familiar with the term level. An aircraft in flight that is not climbing or descending is said to maintain level flight. And if it's neither accelerating nor decelerating, in level flight, the forces of lift and weight are equal, and thrust and drag are equal. We call this a steady flight or an equilibrium flight. This condition exists any time an aircraft is neither accelerating nor decelerating, even in a climb or descent, when these opposing forces are equal. From this steady flight, in order for an aircraft to accelerate, thrust must be increased. This increase in thrust that is required to accelerate must be more than the force of drag that is already acting in the opposite direction. This extra thrust is simply called excess thrust. When excess thrust is applied, the aircraft starts accelerating, but it cannot indefinitely accelerate. The drag starts increasing and catches up, and will eventually equalize thrust in magnitude opposing it. At this point, the aircraft stops accelerating and stabilizes in speed. If drag is greater than thrust, then the opposite happens. The aircraft starts decelerating and slows down. Now let's see how these forces act when an aircraft is in a climb. One might assume that in order for an aircraft to climb, it is the lift force that needs to increase. But with a closer examination, we will see that this is not quite the case. We already know lift is generated perpendicular to the wing surface, and when the aircraft is pitched up to climb, lift is tilted backward, and weight, which was originally acting against lift and perpendicular to the flight path in level flight, in a climb acts rearward relative to the flight path, since it's acting towards the center of the earth. When two forces act on a body pulling it into different directions, the body feels a combination of these two forces and moves in a direction in between these forces. This force felt in between is called a resultant force. When the aircraft is in a climb, resultant forces due to thrust and lift and drag and weight are felt. During a climb, weight may be expressed in two vectors: the weight component that opposes lift and the component of weight that is acting against the flight path. We call this the rear weight component. Remember, in a steady flight, lift equals weight, and therefore, in a climb, lift is slightly reduced as the opposing weight component is also slightly reduced as well, since it is broken down into the rear weight component. You can see the rear weight component acts in the same direction as drag. This adds to the force of drag. Now, in order for an aircraft to climb, thrust must be sufficient to overcome both drag and the added force from the rear weight component. This amounts to a need for extra thrust. This extra thrust is excess thrust. Now do you see, the force responsible for climb is excess thrust, not lift. That is why most light or smaller aircraft use full power during climb. In a descent, these forces work quite the opposite to a climb. During a descent, once thrust is reduced by reducing the engine power or even idling it altogether, the forces that remain are lift acting perpendicular to the wing surface, and drag acting opposite the flight path, and weight acting towards the center of the earth. Remember, with reduced thrust or an idle engine with nearly nil thrust, there is very little force to counteract drag. In this state, the weight of the aircraft acting towards the center of the earth effectively acts forward relative to the flight path. In this condition, weight may be expressed in two vectors, as we did earlier with climb: the weight component that opposes lift and the forward weight component. This forward weight component acts in the direction of the flight path and thrust. When forward weight component together with minimal thrust is equal to drag, then the aircraft descends in a steady flight, that is without acceleration or deceleration. To summarize, there are four main forces in flight when an aircraft is not turning. They are weight, lift, thrust and drag. Lift opposing weight and thrust opposing drag. When lift is equal to weight and thrust is equal to drag in an unaccelerated flight, it is said to be steady flight or an equilibrium flight. This can be in a flight that is level, climbing or descending. Excess thrust is required to climb to compensate for the drag and the added rear weight component and is responsible for climb. In a descent, with reduced thrust or an idle engine, the forward weight component acts in the direction of thrust. Now you know what is weight, lift, thrust, drag, resultant force, vector, components of weight, and how these forces act. How about try answering the questions in the description below to test yourself. If you enjoyed this video, please support our channel by giving us a thumbs up, and do leave your comment below and share this video with your friends. Until next time, keep safe and happy landings.